Chapter 8. The only thing I could think of to do was to admit that I'd overlooked a few lines, but lie about just how many, and hope that I'd be allowed a second chance. When I emerged on the tag end of the crowd, Falconer stood where I had left him, a dozen yards from the playhouse, his face turned toward the river, as though watching the slow progress of the coal barges. I considered bolting, losing myself in the crowd and thence in the streets of the city, but something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was the reward promised me by Simon Bass. Perhaps it was the thought of having to fend for myself in this unfamiliar territory. Perhaps it was both. Then Falconer turned and saw me, and it was too late. Gloomily I approached him. "Well," he said, "I got down most of it." "Most of it?" "Ah, yes, the greater part, nearly all in fact, save for a few wee bits here and there." He smacked his fist into his palm so violently that I shrank back. "Why not all of it?" I couldn't hear well from where I stood. It was a very noisy crowd." Falconer cursed under his breath. "How much is missing exactly?" "I don't ken exactly." 20 lines? 50? 100? I tried to choose a figure that would not sound too drastic, yet would necessitate my coming back to fill in the gaps. "Not 100, I ventured. "Closer to 50, I whiz." "You whiz?" He sighed heavily and stood watching the barges a moment. "When is the next performance of this play?" "Friday, I think." "Friday." Abruptly, he turned to glare at me. "You'd best clean out your ears before then, understood?" "Ah, yes, I will." He stalked off, and I hastened after. As we neared the first of the footbridges, a man appeared from the rear of the playhouse and stepped onto the bridge. Falconer brushed past him so brusquely that he knocked the man off balance. The man stumbled sideways, tripped on the edge of the bridge and splashed into the drainage ditch. He sprang up, dripping wet, strode after Falconer and snatched the back of Falconer's cloak, pulling the hood away from his head. Falconer whirled about, his rapier already sweeping free of his hanger. The other man halted. His hand, too, went to his weapon. But before he could fully draw it, Falconer's sword point leaped forward. The move was so swift I'm not certain I saw it clearly, but I believe he thrust his point through the guard of the other's weapon, then jerked upward. The man's rapier took flight and came to earth in the water of the ditch. With equal quickness, Falconer pulled the hood of his cloak forward again. "Well," said the disarmed man with surprising calm, "you have the advantage of me." Now that I heard his voice, I knew who he was, the first gravedigger in the play. Small wonder I did not recognize him at first. His appearance and speech were radically changed. Within the world of the play, he had been a shabby, half-drunk clown. Outside the playhouse walls, he cut quite a different figure. He was well-built, well-dressed, and well-mannered, with nothing foolish or humble about him, despite the fact that he had just fallen into a ditch and been relieved of his weapon. Falconer was putting away his sword. The player held up a hand to stay him. "Will you not allow me to salvage my weapon, sir, and with it my honor?" Without replying, Falconer thrust his rapier into its hanger and turned away. "May I at least know your name, then? One does not often meet a man with so disarming a manner." I guessed that Falconer would not be able to resist a bit of wordplay, and I was right. "You know my arms. You need not know my name." It took me a moment to grasp the pun. If you recognize a man's coat of arms, then you knew his family name. But the player laughed appreciatively at once. "It does seem to me that there is something familiar about you. Have we met before?" "In another life, perhaps." Falconer strode away. The player gazed after him thoughtfully. I hastened after Falconer, not wishing to be left behind. But the player took hold of the sleeve of my tunic. "What is your master's name?" "Me master? Why, Dr. Bright," I said. Perhaps out of old habit, perhaps as a deliberate lie, I was not sure which. That is Dr. Bright, the player said incredulously, nodding after Falconer's departing figure. That is not me master. I don't ken that weight, and I'm glad of it. The man laughed. He is an unmannerly lout, isn't he? He let go of my sleeve. You're merely a playgoer, then. Tell me, how did you like the play? A country lad like yourself. Oh, very much, I said earnestly, trying not to seem anxious as Falconer faded from me. Did you indeed? He stroked his short beard with a trace of amusement. And what parts did you fancy most? The fencing bout, I said instantly. It looks so real. The man laughed. Excellent! He waded into the ditch and fished out his rapier. I am the company's fencing master, you see. He looked ruefully at the muddy sword. Though you would hardly guess it from that display just now. You are? I was torn between catching up with Falconer and hearing more about the play. Aye. He climbed from the ditch and wiped his weapon in the grass. I frowned. You mock me speech? Not at all, he assured me. I fell into it out of old habit. I'm a country wight myself, born and bred in Yorkshire. Judging from your speech, your master must be a South Country man? Aye. But surely he's not the same Dr. Bright who authored the treatise on melancholy. Aye. You don't mean you ken his work? Oh, we do indeed ken it. In fact, you might tell him that our Mr. Shakespeare has found his book invaluable. As you may have noticed, Hamlet is the very master of melancholy. He clapped me on the shoulder. I'll be off now, or my colleagues will be several beers ahead of me, and I'll have trouble catching up. Laughing, he shook his head and licked his lips. Performing works up a thirst like nothing else. Save dueling, perhaps. Adieu, my young friend. Come, see us again. Unused to such civility, I let him get a dozen paces down the road before I thought to reply. Aye, I called. Thank you. I'll surely do that. After all, I thought, what choice did I have? I found my way back to the bank of the Thames, but Falconer was nowhere in sight. Since I had no penny for passage, and I did not care to risk my life in another boat in any case, I would have to find another way of crossing the river. The only bridge was a formidable one of wood and stone several hundred yards downstream. In truth, it seemed less like a bridge than like a crowded city street, so heavily laden with shops that I feared the whole affair might collapse under the rumbling wheels of the carts and the pounding hooves of the horses. Once safely on the north bank, I asked a cheerful fishwife the way to the George, where I found Falconer eating his supper, fish again. So, you finally found your way, he said. The player held me back. And what did you tell him? Nought, just as you said I should. He stared at me a long moment with his shadowed eyes, as if trying to see into my soul. Then he devoured the last of his meal and rose. I don't like liars, he said, his voice low and harsh. I hope you are not one. I shook my head emphatically, too intimidated to speak. I don't believe he noticed, for he was already on his way upstairs.